on an unsustainable path of spending. It will bring retardation of our economy. What I want to talk about briefly is the impact that this is having on our state and local governments. Essentially, what is happening is that we've seen an erosion of our federalist system. The division of powers that's provided in the Constitution by the 10th Amendment between the federal government and our state and local governments is disappearing. Powers that have been retained by the states are being shifted to the federal government, and the federal government is now imposing unfunded mandates on state and local governments that's eroding their fiscal constitution. Whatever fiscal discipline we've achieved over the last few decades is disappearing as this erosion of the federalist system occurs. The mandates, of course, include rules and restrictions, dictates from the federal government that essentially means states are losing control of their policies. And this is happening at a very rapid rate under this administration. And I want to talk briefly about the two areas where this erosion of the federal system is occurring at a very rapid rate: Medicaid and welfare. Essentially, what the stimulus bill calls for is a significant increase in federal spending for welfare and Medicaid. Now, this has been sold to the states as a way to help them balance their budgets. It will temporarily increase federal spending to offset spending at the state level. Of course, the catch-22 here is that 2 years from now, the states will have to pick up a significant increase in spending as they pick up their share of Medicaid and welfare. Regulatory authority for our Medicaid programs and our welfare programs is shifting from the states back to the federal government. And the federal spending will again be tied to caseloads. Again, we're going to be back in a situation where states will have an incentive to increase their caseloads for Medicaid and welfare in order to generate more federal money. The incentive will be to game the system to increase spending. All of the health care bills that are under consideration by Congress call for a massive increase in Medicaid caseloads. It's estimated that this legislation would increase Medicaid caseloads by 8 million new citizens on Medicaid. Over the next decade, it's estimated that 85 million Americans, a fourth of our citizens, will be on Medicaid at some point over the next decade. This legislation will create a new healthcare bureaucracy that will shift control of healthcare, including Medicaid, from the states to the federal government. These policies amount to a massive new unfunded liability imposed by the federal government on our state governments. And at the same time, regulation and control of welfare and Medicaid will shift from the states to the federal government. What is happening is the federal government is negating 2 decades of reform in our Medicaid programs and in our welfare programs. All the incentives to reform those programs, to reduce caseloads, is disappearing as a result of this legislation. This expansion of the welfare state, essentially what's happening is our country is going to start looking like a European welfare state by the end of this next decade. And this is imposing a very heavy financial burden on our state governments. While the stimulus bill is sold as a temporary period of time where the federal government is going to shore up the finances of the states, in fact, the states will have to cover a much heavier cost of the caseloads of Medicaid and welfare as a result of this legislation. This legislation will crowd out other state programs in order to fund the increased spending for Medicaid and welfare. We can expect increased pressure in the states to raise taxes, to issue debt, in order to finance this higher level of the welfare state. Instead, the states will have an incentive to follow the same profligate policies, fiscal policies, that the federal government is pursuing. And the result will be unconstrained growth of spending at both the state and the federal level as a result of this legislation. We've had no success in constraining the growth of federal spending. Congress has failed for decades now to impose any sort of discipline, constraint on the growth of federal spending through statutes. Congress has failed to enact a balanced budget amendment, which was passed by 33 state legislatures under Article 5 of the Constitution. Our position is if the states are to limit this encroachment of the federal government and to begin to constrain the growth of spending, the states must begin to exercise the powers granted to them under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. And they must exercise this power in terms of the opportunities to change the Constitution. We've introduced a joint resolution. In your handout, there's a brief summary of the joint resolution, and there's also a more detailed statement of the joint resolution. The purpose of this joint resolution is to change the U.S. Constitution, to incorporate in the U.S. Constitution a rule for fiscal discipline at the federal level that you all are living with at the state level. Every state in this country requires a balanced budget. Every state imposes some limit on debt. Most states now have a tax and spending limit. And in Colorado, we have a tax and spending limit that requires voter approval for any increase in taxes, any increase in debt, or expenditure of surplus revenue above the tax and spending limit. And we have a prohibition on unfunded mandates. Basically, this joint resolution will incorporate into the U.S. Constitution the same rules, fiscal rules, that you as state legislators have to live by year after year. We think that this is essential. We recognize that the final form of any amendment to the U.S. Constitution is going to require lots of debate and discussion. Our purpose is to launch that debate with this joint resolution. We would like ALEC to adopt this. And I should emphasize that essentially this joint resolution incorporates in one resolution model legislation resolutions that ALEC has already passed. They already exist in our model legislation or in joint resolutions as separate pieces. We are bringing this together in one single joint resolution. As I say, we know this is going to require lots of discussion and debate. We need to launch it now, we need to start now, and we need to identify legislators willing to begin to impose this type of fiscal discipline on the federal government. We also know that changing the Constitution is not an easy task. There are different ways of approaching this. A constitutional convention, I know in our last couple of meetings we've had some discussions. Is it possible for the states to, with a single uniformly worded amendment, to amend the Constitution directly without going through a constitutional convention? These are constitutional issues. Fortunately, I'm not a constitutional expert, but my colleagues, Dan Woodring and Roman Buehler, are going to be discussing the constitutional issues where I'm sure there will be lots of discussion and debate.